It happened in a boardroom that looked like every other boardroom I had ever been in. A long, polished mahogany table, tall leather chairs, bottled water lined up with precision, and men in navy suits adjusting their ties like armor before battle. But on that morning, the battle wasn't about numbers or projections. It was about respect. And it began with laughter. I walked into that room with my briefcase in one hand, wearing a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, the kind of suit that said, I belonged here, that I had earned every step that brought me to this point. But the moment I opened my mouth to introduce myself, a chuckle rippled down the table, followed by a louder laugh from the chairman himself. He looked right at me and said, Sweetheart, the assistant's desk is out front, not here at the table. My chest tightened. I could feel the sting rise to my face. That instant, the whole room seemed to tilt. Have you ever felt like the walls themselves were watching, like every stare in the room carried the same unspoken thought? She doesn't belong here? That's where I was, standing in front of men who didn't know the truth, men who thought they were humiliating me, when in reality, they were humiliating themselves. They didn't know who I really was. And when the truth came out, the board would freeze in their seats, unable to believe what they had just done. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to the beginning, to how I ended up in that room in the first place. Because this story isn't just about me. It's about every time someone has been underestimated, dismissed, or laughed at simply because of the color of their skin or the sound of their voice. I grew up in Atlanta, the youngest daughter of a school teacher and a postal worker. My parents taught me two things early. Education was my weapon, and dignity was my shield. I wasn't raised with silver spoons or family connections. I was raised with the kind of grit that comes from watching your mom correct papers at the kitchen table until midnight, and your dad walking in exhausted but still smiling after a double shift. I learned early what it felt like to be overlooked. Teachers who assumed I wasn't as sharp as the white kids. Store clerks who followed me down aisles like I was stealing. I grew up understanding that for someone like me, a black girl with big dreams, the road would be twice as long, the climb twice as steep. But I also grew up with the fire to prove them wrong. Fast forward 20 years. I worked my way through Harvard Business School on scholarships, loans, and nights waiting tables. I spent a decade in corporate finance, climbing rungs that were slick with bias and gatekeeping. I had doors slammed in my face, promotions handed to less qualified men, and more than once I was told, you don't have the look of leadership. But every dismissal became fuel. Every no was a reason to sharpen my skills until no one could deny my results. By the time I was 38, I had quietly built a reputation as a fixer, someone who could walk into a failing company and turn it around before the ink dried on the bankruptcy papers. That reputation was the reason I was sitting across from the very board that laughed at me. What they didn't know was that I had already signed papers behind the scenes. They thought I was pitching. In reality, I was preparing to take control. Now let me tell you what led to that exact day. A multinational corporation was on the brink of collapse. On the surface, it looked like an empire. Big offices, global contracts, flashy PR campaigns. But beneath the surface, it was bleeding money, riddled with corruption, and led by a board that was too arrogant to admit they had failed. That's where I came in. My firm had been approached to analyze the mess, and I didn't just find problems, I found opportunity. I found leverage. What they didn't realize was that in underestimating me, they were opening the door for me to walk straight into ownership. Still, before the takeover was revealed, I had to play my role. That's how I found myself walking into their high-rise boardroom with every eye fixed on me, some filled with skepticism, others with thinly veiled hostility. And when the chairman laughed, dismissing me like I was a child lost in the wrong room, I had to swallow the urge to snap back. Because timing, in moments like this, is everything. Have you ever been in a room where you could feel the weight of history pressing down on you? That's what it felt like. I knew every woman who had been told she wasn't tough enough. Every black professional who had been silenced mid-sentence. Every person of color who had been told directly or indirectly, know your place. Their voices echoed in that laugh, in the smirk on that chairman's face. And I stood there carrying all of it. Part of me wanted to shout the truth right then, that I wasn't there to assist. I wasn't there to observe. I wasn't there to beg for a chance. I was there as the woman who would soon have the authority to hire or fire every man in that room. But another part of me, the strategist, knew that silence was sometimes the sharpest weapon. I smiled. I sat down at the far end of the table, opened my folder, and let them underestimate me. 1:30. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to Axiom USA for more powerful true stories. The meeting began with the usual posturing. PowerPoints, charts, buzzwords, men who spoke with authority but not clarity. And every so often someone would glance at me and smirk, like my very presence was an inside joke. One executive leaned over and whispered loudly enough for half the table to hear. "She's probably diversity optics. Every company's got to have one." Another laughed, tapping his pen, saying, "Well, at least she brightens up the room." Do you feel that burn in your chest when someone says something that cuts deep but tries to disguise it as humor? I felt it, and still I stayed calm. Because little did they know, I had the power to flip the script entirely. But in that moment, they kept writing me off, sentence after sentence, laugh after laugh, as they droned on about quarterly losses, about cost overruns, about things they couldn't fix. I took notes, not about their numbers, but about their character. Because sometimes the biggest liabilities in a company aren't on a balance sheet. They're sitting around a table in three-piece suits. Their arrogance was blinding them. Their entitlement was steering the ship straight into an iceberg. And their hypocrisy was about to be the noose they tied for themselves. By the time it was my turn to speak, I could see the impatience in their eyes. One board member leaned back, crossed his arms, and said, "Let's wrap this up. We've wasted enough time." The chairman gestured to me like I was some kind of curiosity, smirking. "All right, sweetheart. You've been quiet. Say your piece, then let the grown-ups talk." That moment was a test. Do I lash out? Demand respect? Throw down my credentials like a gauntlet? Or do I let the silence do the work? Let them keep digging their own grave with every patronizing word? I chose the latter. I cleared my throat, looked each of them in the eye, and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Gentlemen, I'm here to listen first. Because sometimes the best way to understand a company's future is to hear directly from the people who've driven it into the ground." The room went quiet for a second. Then the laughter came again, sharper this time, like they couldn't believe I had dared to call out their failure. But beneath their chuckles, I saw something else flicker across their faces: uncertainty, doubt, the kind that grows when someone doesn't react the way you expect. That was the first crack in their armor, and it wouldn't be the last. The laughter didn't stop after that first meeting. Every time I entered the boardroom, I could feel the sneers before a word was even spoken. These men, most of them white, most of them born into wealth and privilege, couldn't imagine that someone like me, a black woman, younger than many of their daughters, could possibly hold authority over them. Their arrogance blinded them. They talked over me. They dismissed my questions. When I pointed out inconsistencies in their reports, one director waved his hand and said, "Don't trouble your head with details." "Darling," another whispered just loud enough. "Is she here for the minutes or the coffee? Do you know what it's like to be doubted in stereo? To have condescension coming at you from every direction, while the truth sits burning at the back of your tongue? That was my every minute in that room. But here's the thing about arrogance. It creates blind spots. And blind spots are where the truth slips in unnoticed. Behind the scenes, my lawyers had already secured the acquisition. I had signed the documents that made me majority shareholder. The ink was dry, the deal irreversible. But timing mattered. If I revealed myself too soon, they'd find ways to stall, to undermine, to weaponize their networks against me. So I sat through their mockery, documenting every slight, every racist comment, every moment they showed their hand. Because eventually those receipts would be more valuable than any spreadsheet. One man in particular, Richard Hanover, became the face of their disdain. A senior board member in his late 50s, with silver hair slicked back and a smirk that never left his lips. Richard had built his career on insider deals and old boy networks, and he hated me the moment I walked in. He made it his mission to belittle me at every turn. "Pretty speech," he'd say after I presented. Or, You've got passion, I'll give you that, but this isn't Sunday school. He saw me as a threat long before the others did. And in trying to put me down, he exposed himself more than anyone else. What kept me going through those meetings were the glimmers of support. Not everyone laughed. There was Maria, a Latina executive in her 40s, who held my gaze when others rolled their eyes. There was Alan, a younger white analyst who slipped me notes of encouragement after meetings, telling me my observations were spot on. Their silence during the laughter hurt, but their quiet solidarity reminded me I wasn't alone. And then there were the bystanders, the rest of the staff who sat in the back, taking notes, watching the board degrade me. Some smirked. Some looked down in shame. Some avoided my eyes entirely. That's the thing about injustice. It doesn't just test the oppressed. It tests everyone in the room. If this story has you hooked, hit like and share it to support Axiom USA. The turning point came during a critical quarterly meeting. The board was arguing about whether to sell off an entire division, a decision that would cost thousands of employees their jobs. They debated it like they were moving chess pieces, detached and arrogant. Finally, the chairman turned to me and said, "Well, sweetheart, you've been quiet again. Any brilliant ideas before we make a real decision?" I leaned forward, looked at each of them, and said, "Yes. I think the real decision you should be worrying about is whether to clear out your offices now or wait until the end of the day." Silence. Nervous chuckles. Richard narrowed his eyes. "And why's that?" I slid a folder across the table. Inside were the acquisition documents. My name, in bold print, listed as majority shareholder and incoming CEO. "Because as of this morning," I said, "this company is mine." You could have heard a pin drop. The color drained from faces that had been flushed with arrogance just moments earlier. The chairman stammered. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. This can't be legal." Maria smiled for the first time that day. Alan let out a quiet yes under his breath. And the rest of the board froze, literally froze, like statues who had just realized their strings were cut. All their laughter, all their mockery, all their dismissals turned into silence heavier than stone. The irony was sharp. The same men who had told me I didn't belong in the room were now staring at me as their boss. The same man who called me sweetheart now had to address me as Madam CEO. The same board that laughed when I called out their failures was now powerless under my authority. And I won't lie, there was satisfaction in that. But it wasn't just about ego. It was about justice. It was about every time someone like me had been told no, every time a black woman's competence had been questioned, every time laughter had been used as a weapon. In that moment, I wasn't just taking control of a company. I was taking back the dignity they tried to strip away. The aftermath was as dramatic as the reveal itself. Richard refused to accept it. He stormed out, called his lawyer, tried to rally other shareholders. But arrogance doesn't win against contracts. Within weeks, he was forced to resign. The chairman, too, stepped down in disgrace. The staff who once smirked at me now lined up to shake my hand. Some apologized. Some just avoided my gaze, too ashamed to admit what they'd joined in on. But the ones who had supported me quietly, Maria, Alan, they became my allies as we rebuilt the company. Want to hear more untold stories of injustice and resilience? Subscribe to Axiom USA and never miss one. The climax wasn't just the board freezing. It was walking into that same boardroom weeks later, this time at the head of the table, the nameplate in front of me reading Chief Executive Officer. It was hearing the hush fall when I spoke. Not because I was mocked, but because I was respected, or at least feared. It was the irony of Richard's empty chair, a reminder of how quickly arrogance collapses. And it was the knowledge that somewhere, some young black girl dreaming of leadership would hear this story and know that laughter doesn't define you, resilience does. The resolution wasn't perfect. Racism doesn't vanish with one victory. Bias doesn't evaporate overnight. But what changed was the balance of power. They could no longer laugh in my face without consequence. They could no longer dismiss me without repercussion. And that shift matters. Because every time one barrier falls, it weakens the walls built to keep us out. Thanks for watching Axiom USA, where every story reminds us of resilience and truth. Like, share, and subscribe for more. So here's my question to you. When they laughed at me, did they laugh because they truly believed I was powerless, or because deep down they feared what would happen if I wasn't? And when the truth finally came out, when they froze in their seats, was that justice? Or was it just the beginning of a much larger reckoning?